Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, was no stranger to controversy. His theories broke social taboos, challenged moral standards, and exposed truths most people weren't ready to face. But perhaps one of the most unsettling and heavily criticized ideas he ever shared was his view on female desire, a subject so sensitive in his time that parts of it were labeled dangerous, even banned. To understand Freud's perspective, we must first step into the Vienna of the late 19th and early 20th century. Women's sexuality was cloaked in silence. Society preferred to think of women as pure, modest, and devoid of primal urges. But Freud, through his clinical work, began to see a completely different picture, one that shattered the Victorian fantasy. Freud believed that female desire was not a secondary or weaker version of male desire, but a powerful, complex, and deeply rooted force within the unconscious mind. He argued that while men often expressed their sexuality openly, women's desires were often repressed, hidden beneath layers of social conditioning, moral expectations, and the fear of judgment. And here's where his theory became unsettling. He suggested that repression did not eliminate desire, it intensified it. In his view, suppressed passions did not vanish, they transformed into psychological symptoms. Anxiety, hysteria, dreams, slips of the tongue, and even physical ailments with no medical cause. To Freud, these were not random, they were the disguised language of the unconscious. He also explored a controversial idea he called penis envy, the belief that young girls, upon realizing anatomical differences, experienced a deep sense of loss or longing. While today many critics argue that this theory was shaped by the sexism of his time, Freud himself used it to explain the psychological tension women felt when confronting their roles in a male-dominated world. But beyond the biological implications, what truly disturbed his critics was his underlying suggestion that female desire was not simply about reproduction or romance, but about power, autonomy, and identity. Freud's patients often revealed their longings indirectly. Through dreams, they spoke of forbidden relationships, acts of dominance or submission, and moments of transgression. Freud claimed that these unconscious fantasies, while rarely acted upon, shaped women's behavior, relationships, and emotional lives. To him, the real scandal wasn't that women had sexual desires, it was that their desires could be as raw, primal, and aggressive as men's. One of the most radical points Freud made was that civilization itself depends on the repression of sexual instincts. In other words, without suppressing these desires, society would descend into chaos. But he also warned that over-repression could create deep neuroses, especially in women whose sexuality was already silenced by culture. This balance between control and expression became one of the central tensions in Freud's work. He believed that female desire, when denied expression, would find other outlets: passive-aggressive behavior, emotional manipulation, or extreme devotion to ideals and causes. In his eyes, this was not weakness, but an adaptation, a way for the unconscious to be heard when society refused to listen. And perhaps this is why Freud's theory was considered dangerous. If his ideas were accepted, They would challenge the very foundation of gender roles. They would imply that women's sexuality was not fragile or dependent on men, but a force in its own right, a force that could not be entirely controlled. The more Freud published, the more his critics accused him of corruption, immorality, and even misogyny. But those who studied his work closely saw something different, an attempt to bring into the open what society wanted to keep hidden. In a way, Freud wasn't creating desire, he was uncovering it. He once said, "The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing." For Freud, the voice of female desire was exactly that, soft, hidden, but relentless. It could be denied for a time, but never erased. The so-called band theory of Freud's is not just about sexuality, it's about truth. It's about the unspoken forces that shape human behavior. And it's a reminder that what society fears most is often not violence or chaos, but the power of what lies hidden in the human soul, especially when it comes from those it has tried to silence. Freud's unsettling truth remains as relevant today as it was a century ago. Desire, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface. And when it does, it can shatter illusions, rewrite identities, and challenge the very structures of power.
Freud's theory about female desire did not emerge from abstract philosophy. It was built on years of clinical observation. In his private practice, he listened to women who, in the eyes of society, had everything: wealth, marriage, social status. Yet many of them came to him with symptoms no doctor could explain: paralysis in the limbs, fainting spells, unexplained pain, sudden outbursts of emotion. Freud began to suspect these symptoms were not caused by any physical disease, but by psychic conflict, a war between what the women truly wanted and what they were told they were allowed to want. This conflict, he believed, was the root of what was then called hysteria. One of his most famous patients was Bertha Pappenheim, known in his writings as Anna O. She suffered from partial paralysis, hallucinations, and speech disorders. Through what she called the talking cure, Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer discovered that her symptoms often disappeared when she spoke freely about her hidden thoughts and memories, many of which had sexual undertones that she could never express openly in her life. For Freud, Anna O was proof of a disturbing reality. When desire is forbidden, it doesn't disappear. It turns inward, attacking the body and mind. But Freud didn't stop there. He began to explore dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. In his landmark book, The Interpretation of Dreams, he revealed that many women's dreams contained hidden sexual symbols: water representing birth, locked rooms symbolizing hidden passions, and dangerous journeys representing the pursuit of forbidden pleasure. These dreams were often filled with longing, jealousy, rivalry, and even aggression, emotions society denied women could possess in relation to their sexuality. And here's the most unsettling part. Freud argued that female desire could be just as competitive, possessive, and power-driven as male desire. He claimed that deep in the unconscious, women could harbor fantasies of dominance, seduction, or even destruction. This was not the gentle, passive image society painted of them. This was a raw, primal force. This theory was considered so dangerous because it implied that the angel in the house image of women was a cultural fabrication. If women's inner lives were acknowledged as complex and sexually charged, it would threaten the foundation of patriarchal control. The very laws, moral codes, and marriage customs of the time were built on the idea that women's desire was secondary and manageable. Freud's theory struck at the heart of that belief. Another controversial idea he put forward was the Oedipus complex in its female form, sometimes called the Electra complex by later theorists. He suggested that girls, like boys, go through a stage where their affections and attachments are tangled with unconscious rivalries and desires. In this stage, a girl may unconsciously compete with her mother for the attention of her father, creating complex emotional patterns that could shape her relationships for life. Freud's critics accused him of over-sexualizing human development, but to him, sexuality was not just about physical acts, it was about energy, attachment, and identity. And in women, this energy was often redirected, masked, or split into socially acceptable outlets: charity work, intense friendships, religious devotion, while the deeper currents remained unacknowledged. But why did Freud believe this theory was banned in practice? Because acknowledging it required admitting that society itself was complicit in the repression and distortion of female sexuality. It wasn't just individual men controlling women, it was an entire system of cultural, religious, and legal structures designed to keep desire in check. Freud even hinted at a political implication. If women's sexuality were fully liberated, the entire social order might collapse. This wasn't an endorsement, it was an observation of how fragile societal control really was when faced with primal human instincts. In the end, Freud's unsettling truth wasn't just about women, it was about all of us. It was a reminder that the unconscious doesn't care about laws, morals, or appearances. It speaks in symbols, slips, and symptoms, always seeking a way to express what has been silenced. A century later, we can see how his theory still echoes in modern culture. The debates about female desire, autonomy, and power are far from over. In media, politics, and personal relationships, the same tensions Freud identified still shape our world. And perhaps the most dangerous thing about his theory is that it asks us to look inward, not just at women's desires, but at the hidden, unspoken forces driving every human being. Because in the end, Freud's banned theory is not just about desire, it's about truth. And truth, once seen, can never be unseen.
After Freud's death in 1939, his theories didn't simply vanish. They evolved, clashed with new ideas, and sparked entire movements in psychology. Many psychoanalysts who followed in his footsteps rejected certain aspects of his banned theory about female desire, but they couldn't escape its influence. By the mid-20th century, thinkers like Karen Horney
began to challenge Freud's concept of penis envy, arguing instead that the real issue wasn't anatomical, it was power envy. Horney claimed that women's frustrations came not from physical differences, but from being excluded from male-dominated spheres of influence. In her view, what Freud interpreted as biological longing was actually a reaction to social inequality. Meanwhile, others like Jacques Lacan kept Freud's ideas alive by reinterpreting them through language and culture. Lacan argued that desire, male or female, is not a straightforward biological drive, but something shaped by symbols, language, and the roles we play in society. This meant that female desire was not less than male desire. It was simply coded differently, expressed through indirect means, and often disguised in socially acceptable forms. Fast forward to today, and we see echoes of Freud everywhere, whether we agree with him or not. The way modern psychology, media, and even advertising talk about female sexuality still dances around the same tension he identified: the conflict between expression and repression. Consider the world of social media. On one hand, it allows women to express themselves more freely than ever before. On the other, it creates new forms of pressure, judgment, and comparison that drive certain desires underground. Just like in Freud's time, the unconscious finds ways to express itself indirectly, through curated images, suggestive captions, or even the type of relationships women choose to display publicly versus those they keep hidden. Even in therapy today, psychologists recognize that unexplored desire, whether sexual, emotional, or creative, can manifest as anxiety, depression, or self-destructive behavior. Modern clinicians may not use Freud's exact language, but the underlying principle is the same. What you repress will eventually find a way out. The interesting thing is how pop culture has embraced the darker, more primal side of female desire. Films, novels, and TV series often portray women as complex beings with hidden appetites, double lives, and private rebellions against societal norms. Characters like these would have been scandalous in Freud's Vienna, but today they're celebrated as symbols of empowerment. Yet this empowerment narrative is not without contradictions. Many modern depictions of female desire are still filtered through a male gaze, reinforcing certain stereotypes rather than dismantling them. Freud would probably point out that even in these expressions, the unconscious is at work, shaping fantasies to fit what is still socially acceptable. And here lies the modern relevance of Freud's unsettling truth. Liberation is never absolute. Desire will always live in tension with the structures around it, whether those structures are religious, cultural, or digital. The question isn't whether female desire exists, it's whether society is ready to face it in its raw, unfiltered form. Freud's warning still applies. When desire is denied a healthy outlet, it doesn't die, it mutates. It might appear as obsessive ambition, as an attraction to toxic relationships, or as an unexplainable sense of dissatisfaction. And this is not just about women. Men experience the same unconscious dynamics. but because women's desire has been policed for centuries, its reemergence often feels more disruptive, more threatening to the status quo. In a sense, Freud's banned theory was never truly banned. It simply went underground, just like the desires it described. It's in our literature, in our media, in our private confessions to friends or therapists. It's in the silent glances, the double meanings, and the choices we make without fully understanding why. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, that deep down, we are still playing the same psychological game Freud described over a century ago. We're still negotiating between what we want and what we're told we're allowed to want. We're still building walls between our conscious and unconscious selves and pretending they're not there. In the end, Freud's work challenges us to do something most people find uncomfortable, to be radically honest with ourselves about our own desires. Because only then can we understand their true power, not as something shameful to be hidden, but as a driving force that shapes who we are, how we love, and the lives we create. Perhaps that's why his theory was considered dangerous, because the moment you recognize your own desire, you also recognize your own power. And power, once realized, is very hard to control.